Hello and welcome to Metacast episode 25. And I'm your host Ilya Bezdilev, and with me is Arnab Deka from sunny Vancouver. Today we have a special episode since we've released 25 episodes so far. We had 24 in the bonus one. And we've talked to a bunch of really cool professional people who do podcasting. We've decided to put together an episode on how you start a podcast in 2023, along with best practices and tips that we've heard from all of those people that we've talked to, and also our own learnings.
Mostly our learnings.
From those people.
Yeah.
We have also consolidated all of that in a book and a video course that you can access through the links in the show notes and also on our website. Without further ado, let's just go for it.
And one special note, this is a video episode, as you can see. Or if you're hearing on a podcast, you can also see this on YouTube and maybe other places where we'll put the video on. And Ilya and I are going to try and basically stay on topic today. All right. So first off, Ilya, how do you start a podcast? There's so many things to think through.
Yeah, I think when you start a podcast, you can really be bogged down by the amount of details that come into this, like microphone and sound and post-production, and how do you publish, how do you promote your podcast?
Recording.
There's a lot of stuff that goes in there. In fact, all of those steps are very simple, but you have to know what the steps are. And that's why we are putting this together, because we actually want to walk everybody through the steps of how you start a podcast, kind of demystify them. Because if you think about the podcast, especially if you watch folks like Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman, they're like, oh, these guys have these great rooms and have those microphones and probably cameras that are like the same quality as CNN uses. And you could be really put off by that. But in fact, you can start very cheap or even free if you want to. So let's first start with the gear that you use. First thing you need for a podcast, you want it to sound good. So never use Airpods, never use kind of cheap microphone from your laptop or stuff like that. Buy a microphone. That's probably be the biggest investment you'll do in the initial stage. And then you can always upgrade later.
Biggest as in the most significant, but in terms of money, it might not be that big.
I guess it depends where you are, right? If you're somewhere in rural India, spending $100 on a microphone might be a lot of money. But if you're in the US or Western Europe, like $100 might be just nothing to you, but it will be the highest investment in terms of initial quality you get. So what we would recommend buying for your first episodes, get a Blue Yeti microphone. Yes, this is a Blue Yeti that Arnab shows, and I also show it in my hand. This microphone costs less than $150 US, and it's pretty versatile. It can record audio in pretty good quality. It has multiple modes. It's not the perfect microphone for podcasting. Let's just make it straight, right? But it is a very good, very decent microphone. All of the episodes that we've recorded so far, Arnab has been using Blue Yeti. And I think I was using Blue Yeti on one of those too. It's a good microphone. Many podcasters use it. It's probably the best microphone for the price to quality ratio.
And as you can hear, if it's making me sound like this, which I don't in person, I think it's a good microphone.
Yeah. Those mics, you can use them for meetings that you take. You see, if you work at a job where you need to join meetings online, then you use that microphone as well. And everybody is so impressed with the quality of your speech. Well, and I guess a pro tip, you can probably expense that microphone for work if you can negotiate with your manager. Actually, I got this Blue Yeti for free from my employer when I was doing some video presentations, and they just gifted it to me. I don't use the Blue Yeti, but it was nice to have it fully paid for. If you want to go a bit higher in terms of quality, you can get one of those Shure MV7 microphones that I'm using. I think to an untrained ear, they will be pretty much indistinguishable from Blue Yeti. So I would say don't stress about it. It's $250. It has a USB connection, connects straight to your computer. It's a great microphone, but again, you don't have to spend $250. You can spend $140. I think that's what Blue Yeti costs.
So I guess my ears are trained at this point because I can definitely feel the difference between when you're on a Blue Yeti versus on the Shure MV7.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you have an extra $100, buy an V7. And if you really want to go like Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan level, then you can buy Shure SM7B, which we don't have, so I don't have anything to show. But then get prepared to spend $450 for the microphone, and then another $100 or so for an audio interface like this. This particular one I hold in my hand, I use it for music. That's more like $200, but you can get a smaller version of that for about, I think, $99 or so on Amazon. But then you also need to buy cables and a bunch of other stuff. So it will cost you probably $600 or so with all of the necessary gear. And also, if you want to record on the go, then you have to carry all of the gear with you. The cool thing about Blue Yeti or Shure MV7 is you can buy it with a stand. Blue Yeti comes with a stand. For Shure MV7, you have to buy a separate stand, or you can buy it as a bundle with like a nice small tripod. You can easily just plug it into your laptop and record from anywhere you wish. Actually, in fact, the very first episode I ever recorded for my podcast 2.5 years ago or so, I did it in Hawaii. I was on vacation and I had this I have to start a podcast. So I ordered that microphone straight to that house in Hawaii where we stayed, and I recorded my episode right there. So yeah, I didn't have to have my audio interface or all of those cables. It just worked out of the box.
Wonders of the modern world.
Yeah. So the microphone is important, like $140 or so for Blue Yeti, or a little bit more expensive for others. The other thing that is highly recommended is get good headphones. Like what I'm wearing right now is Audio-Technica. Those are the high quality studio headphones that people use for producing music. And you don't have to have those, but they would be highly recommended at later stages when you edit your podcast. You want to hear the noises. And if you use something like Airpods, you just may not be able to hear the tiny noises that could be audible otherwise.
So pretty much any decent, good quality over-the-ear headphones would work, I think, for beginners.
Yes, yeah. Try to get studio quality. They're also very nice for listening to music. You can actually get Audio-Technica lower-end version, $50 to $100. You can get very decent quality headphones. If you pay a little bit more, you can get those with Bluetooth. Like my headphones have Bluetooth. I think they were $170 or so. They just make editing a little bit more easy. But when I record, I use a cable because I want to minimize the latency. But when I edit, I use Bluetooth.
But I think between the mic and the headphones, prioritize the mic.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Prioritize the mic. And also when you record, you can always use Airpods as your headphones, but the microphone as your recording device. So you can always upgrade later. So microphone is one of those things, like if you start without a microphone, you can produce something that sounds really shitty and nobody really want to listen to it. Quality doesn't matter after a certain point, but below a certain point, quality matters. Actually, we will have later in this episode a clip of somebody who recorded using AirPods, and you will just hear how terrible it sounds. It's workable, but it's not good.
It's very distracting to the listener when the audio quality is not bad, because instead of focusing on what you're saying, they're focusing on trying to figure out what you're trying to say.
Exactly, yes. There is another hack, though. I'm not sure about Android, but if you have an iPhone, there are some very decent ways to record in high quality on an iPhone, which you can do basically for free if you already have the phone. There's an app called Voice Recorder Pro, which you get free of charge. You can use that Voice Recorder Pro, put your phone in a sock. And here's why. On a microphone, I have this foamy thing, which I'll now take out, and I'll shut up for a second so that you don't hear me, don't hear all the scratchy noises. Yeah, that foamy thing is called the pop filter. And you put it on the microphone so that it catches kind of breaths and those sounds. It makes the quality better, especially when you speak very close to it. That's the function that a sock performs. So everybody has a sock. If you have an iPhone, you will have a sock. So you put the phone in the sock and record using the Voice Recorder Pro, and that works just perfectly fine.
So I noticed that the Blue Yeti doesn't have that kind of a soft shell on it. Is the pop filter still like the hard part that we're seeing?
If you use a Blue Yeti and you don't have that soft shell on it, that pop filter, you can buy a standalone pop filter that looks like this. It gets attached to your microphone boom, and it looks like this. You probably have seen this on the radio, in radio shows. Yeah, you can use one of those. It's like a mesh that catches those air particles and those extra sounds. So, but Arnab, you don't have that much of a popping in your voice. So I guess that's why it works well. But if you get somebody who is more poppy, then they may not sound as well as you do.
Okay, so that's a lot of great tips, which microphones and headphones and all that. The room itself that you're recording in, that plays a big part, right?
That plays arguably equally important part as a microphone, if not even bigger. And the reason why is noise. Good microphones pick up a lot of noise. I think what we've gotten accustomed to with Zoom calls and Google Meet calls is that those tools actually, case in point, Arnab just had somebody turn on the shower. I think that's what it was. And we started hearing the water.
And that's like 2 floors above here.
2 floors above here, right? So that's just how sensitive those microphones are. So you want to avoid all that. So your recording space should be as quiet as possible. And that means you close your windows. Even if it's very hot outside, well, guess what? If you want to produce a high quality podcast, you have to close the windows. You need to turn off air conditioning. You need to turn off heaters. It might be uncomfortable, but dress up or undress, because otherwise you will hear that humming noise that in the recording, and that's not gonna sound nice.
Yeah, right after recording our sessions, Ilya, you turn on your AC and we can hear how much background noise there is.
And I'm based out of Florida. It's getting very hot. It's summer. So I'll be drenched in sweat by the end of this recording, but you do what you have to do to have a high quality episode. Another thing that was in one of my recordings, actually the very first episode, I was a guest on somebody else's podcast. We recorded in the phone in the sock because I didn't want to invest in a microphone, and it turned out just fine. I had a washing machine or a dryer in the room next to me. It was all in the recording, and we had to remove this in post-production. It was not good. Another thing that actually was in my first recording of my own podcast, I had my wife and my kids in the kitchen, 2 rooms removed from where I was, and we could still hear those dishes and all that. So you want to minimize sounds as much as possible. Then also turn your phone on vibration.
Do not disturb mode.
Actually, not even do not disturb. Like I would say, put it in the airplane mode. Just get rid of all notifications. So quiet is best. The other thing is reverberation. Reverberation is when sound that your mouth produces is reflected back from hard surfaces. Yes, walls, right? And it reflects from the first surface that it hits, then it reflects from other surfaces, and then you end up with a lot of reverberation or echo. I guess echo is just a very strong reverberation, or reverberation is a mild echo. That's how you can describe it. And you probably have seen these things. It's like a foamy thing that you put your microphone here, like in front of it, and then you like this, and so the sound gets absorbed by that foamy thing, and that's one of the challenges with those things because they obstruct the view. So if you are doing an audio only show, you can just do it like this, and it's totally fine. But if you're doing a video show, that's not gonna be looking nice. Even though that foam absorbs the sound, there's still sound coming kind of sideways into your back. So you want to have something like those panels that I have behind me. They're like sound absorption panels. They are pretty inexpensive, but they require a lot of work. So there's a hack. You can go to a closet and be surrounded by clothing, which are very good at absorbing sound. Or if you have a bookshelf, books are very good at absorbing sound. At some point, I had a camping mat that I was putting next to me so that it would absorb sound. The other hack you can use is you can surround your microphone with pillows. So you see, like if you are a bit creative, like as long as you have my microphone, you can address all of those other issues with just everyday things that you have in your house.
One tip we heard from our sound engineer, Misha, was that there was a lot of echo coming back from the table the microphone is sitting on, probably because it was very quick, right? So now I put a towel on the table and then I put the books, and then I put the microphone on top of it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And also, you want to be as close to the microphone as possible without actually eating the microphone, because more of your voice comes to the microphone than the reflections from the walls of the room.
Okay, so next up, after you got your microphone and you have a room and everything, how do you record?
You can use different software for recording. You can go with an iPhone in the Voice Recorder Pro app. That's one way to record it. You can record directly to the computer with tools like Audacity or Reaper, which we can talk about later. You can use specialized software for podcasting, which is what we recommend, but it will cost you some extra money. So tools like Squadcast, Riverside, Zencaster, they allow you to have a call, like a Zoom call, a Google Meet call, where audio is recorded locally in high quality, and then you can edit that. Those tools will cost you in the range of $15 to $20 a month.
Subscription.
Subscription. They're not free, but especially if you're doing interview podcasts where you invite guests, those simplify work for your guests exponentially.
And for you.
And for you as well, right? But you're in it, so you can take a bit of pain. But if you invite somebody who is a busy person to talk on your podcast, and it's like your first episode and they said yes, well, make sure it's easy for them. And one hack here is those tools, not all of them, but I think Riverside does have a free, like 1 hour or 2 hours of recording that you can have, or a few days of recording. I don't remember which one it was. So you can do your first one for free and then see if it works for you.
And I think, like Brian said in our second episode, he uses Zoom when he has guests over, but he uses the local audio. So he doesn't actually, Zoom is just for talking to people on a call, but then he uses the audio locally for everybody.
I think it's $10 to $15 a month. It's unlimited hours, unlike other tools. And also you can use Zoom for other purposes. Like you can use it for your business. Or actually, you might already have a subscription if you are a business. So yeah, Zoom is another way to record this.
Or if you manage to keep your recordings to below 40 minutes, it can be free too.
It doesn't record locally though.
Okay, that's a paid feature. So that's a lot of good tips about the tools to use, the microphone and all that. How about like video?
I suggest first listen to a clip by Rock Felder, who was a guest on our show. He's a co-founder and CFO of Squadcast.
Video content is so much more than audio. I mean, the equipment cost is different. You got to now think about lighting in addition to having a camera and all that stuff. And then just the actual editing and production of it is not like double the time of an audio show. It's probably like quadruple maybe. Video is absolutely something that I think should be embraced, but only if you're ready. If you're still having trouble staying consistent with your audio show, you might not want to start adding on video.
Because Rock is one of the people who run Squadcast, they know the data. And as he said, producing video is quadruple the amount, or 4x the amount of time it takes to produce audio. So think about it. If you record 1 hour of an audio podcast, it will probably take you about 3 hours to produce that 1 hour of audio. It will take you another 12 hours to produce a video. That's a lot of work. It is definitely a lot of work. So we do not recommend starting with video right away unless you already have the chops. Or maybe like you're a teenager without a job. That's totally cool, right? But when I was first doing my podcast, I was fully employed. Spending 20 hours a week just wouldn't work for me with like two kids and all. So yeah, start with audio. If you manage to get consistent with audio, then think about video.
Which is why we are 25 episodes in before we thought, okay, let's attempt this.
Yeah, we would have given up at episode 3, I think, if we were doing video. We actually tried to do a video episode. I think it was episode 7. And then I looked at it and I'm like, there was so much stuff that I wanted to cut out of it. I'm like, no, I'm not doing this. So yeah, only 25 episodes in video doing this.
Okay, so that's a lot of like great tips, mostly about the tech and tools side, right? What's going to make or break your podcast is actually the content. What are you going to talk about?
You got to have the goods.
How do you go about it to figure out what do you want to talk about, the style of the podcast, whether you're going to have guests or not?
First of all, it depends on why you're doing your podcast. If you are a business that wants to attract customers to buy more of your products or more of your services, then you obviously talk about what you're good at and attract the audience that will convert to your customers. Or you may run a podcast to attract people to work for your company. If you're really like growing and then you want to talk about your expertise and basically make people want to work with you. That's one thing, right? By the way, I'm not talking about like commercial enterprises like Wondery or NPR. We are not in that category. I don't even want to speculate about how they do things. They are at a different level.
We are talking about people who just want to start their own podcast.
Yeah, if you're just doing this for fun or maybe to build your own personal brand, then you definitely want to have fun when you do this. You want to enjoy it.
Otherwise, you'll give up.
Yeah, because like what will sustain you? Especially that initial listenership will be very, very low. So yeah, it's something to remember. So you have to have that passion. You have to have that fun. You have to have the expertise and knowledge in the things that you're talking about. Or if you're just like rambling about stuff, you have to enjoy it. Like absolutely have to enjoy it. The first guest of our podcast, Brian McCullough, who runs Tech Meme Ride Home and the Internet History podcast, said that you are more likely to be successful in a niche. And we agree with that. So he found his niche to be the history of the internet. And he was talking to all of those companies, the employees and founders of all of those companies that were active in the 90s. And guess what? People were waiting for somebody to do that. And he was given some advice on our podcast that, maybe you guys should do like a history of podcasting, which we are now attempting to do. We are discovering and finding people who were at the outset of the podcasting revolution back 20 years ago. So yeah, if you find a niche, discovery might take time, but you're more likely to be enjoyed, more likely to build a loyal audience.
If you have a hobby that you're interested in, try to find other podcasts that are in that space and see what they're doing. And if you feel like there's a lack of it, or you could do a better job with one of those things, go for it.
Yeah. There was one podcast I came across that I really enjoyed a few episodes of. Guys were talking about vocals, but they were talking about a specific type of singing. I listened for a specific guest that I liked listening to. It's a band called Marmozets, and their vocalist Becky McIntyre, wasn't it? But they found their own niche where they themselves are singers in this style and they invite people who sing in this style, and probably people who sing in this style also listen to them. And I don't know how much listenership they have, probably not in the millions, but those, thousands, tens of thousands that they have, they're probably very loyal, because I don't know if there is any other podcast like this. Because the niche is too small. You can be just like the only thing in it. The other thing that is very important is authenticity. Especially if you're doing this for fun, like being somebody else, unless it's like a theatrical thing that you like to perform. If it's your thing, yeah, just go for it. Like impersonate, some character in your podcast. But if you are like a regular person, you probably just want to be yourself.
Yeah.
And, being open, being vulnerable, talking about personal stuff, it all pays off because it helps the people build the connection with you. And, I actually want to play a clip from our episode 20 with Justin Jackson, the co-founder and CEO of a podcast hosting service, Transistor.fm, about people seeking human connection in podcasts.
A lot of people listen to podcasts for human connection, to get human insight that they wouldn't normally get, because in the long form, people will often say things or reveal things that are very human that as a listener you can identify with. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know anyone else thought that way, or I didn't realize other people had that experience, or wow, I've always wondered about that. And it creates this parasocial connection, but it's still a connection, a human connection. That's a big reason a lot of people listen just for that.
I previously heard from people that when they listen to my podcast and to our podcast now, is as if they had a conversation with us. And that's why people like kind of talk shows. That's why they like just people being authentic and just ramble about stuff.
Plus, I think finding something that you're passionate about, being authentic about it, this is the only way to be sustainable. Otherwise, you will give up after a few episodes, even if you try very hard. All right. So now that you have a topic in mind, how do you name your podcast?
Do not put the name podcast in your podcast name. So the word podcast, you'll just get drowned by other podcasters, other podcasts. The thing about the name is that you have to pick something unique that people can easily search and find. Like, actually, even Metacast, there are a couple of other podcasts with the same name, but I think we are slowly rising to the top. But our initial idea was to name the podcast Podcast, because it's a podcast about podcasting. But guess what? If we named it this way, we would never show anywhere close to the top of the search. So if you do something like this, make sure that people can easily find it. Find and remember. It's simple and easy to spell. Like, I actually like the name Moody Girl. I listened to one episode of that show and it was very easy to find. Something like that, right? It doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. It could be just your name if your name is easy to pronounce. Like, I would recommend using my name as the name of the podcast.
Well, Ilya, the first part is easy to pronounce, so.
You will be surprised how often it is misspelled. Because capital I and small L look exactly the same in English.
And I think the other part of what you said actually keys into this is Metacast. There are a few podcasts like that. So when we used to initially search, ours would be like the 6th or 7th one. But being consistent, and you can only be consistent and sustainable if you're authentic and you have passion for the topic. Being consistent pays off in all these like Apple and Spotify and all that. Promoting, or not promoting as in, but at least giving more prominence to your show in search if you produce episodes regularly.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen us rise in Apple search and Spotify search and also on Google search.
So now that you have a funky name, unique name, how do you like generate a logo?
Look at how the logo or your cover art is displayed in podcasting apps. It usually shows in squares that are not too large. And also there is no text next to it in some of the apps, or the text is cropped. So you need to make sure that your logo stands on its own. If you look at all of the popular podcasts, they all have something written on the cover art. Like the Tim Ferriss Show would have the Tim Ferriss Show in very large letters. They probably take 1/3 of the space of the cover art. I would say don't stress out. You can always replace your cover art later. Just go to canva.com. It's a free tool for creating graphics. Just pick one of the templates, one of the free templates, and just go for it. That's what we did. We picked one of the free templates, the Metacast word, and the effects on it. I just grabbed it from template. I think I changed the color, but otherwise it was the standard. And the podcast about podcasting on our logo. There is a podcast called Book Club Girl, which use this way of writing their name, these 3 big words in this serif font. And I'm like, okay, this looks good. So I just did the same thing for our show, just different words in addition to the larger logo. So yeah, look for inspiration in what others do. Best artists steal. I mean, make it your own, change the colors. Don't rip off the graphics. Put your picture, rearrange it a little bit. Canva makes it very easy. I would say don't spend more than a couple of hours doing that. It doesn't matter at the end of the day for your initial episodes because no one will listen to those anyway.
Right.
Except your friends.
And you can change the image later anyway.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Focus on the content.
Yeah.
Okay. Talking about content, I listen to quite a few podcasts that don't have intro music or any music at all. Some with intro music, some with a lot of editorial music and sounds. What's your feel for this?
I think music and all of those sounds, they're really, really amazing. They make the content much more engaging. Not having anything, I've tried that before. It sounds very boring when you don't have any intro. But even probably more importantly, people associate podcast with the music that they hear.
Yeah.
So when your intro starts playing, people would know that's your podcast. And I know the music for the top podcasts that I listen to. So you want to have something catchy. But music in the middle, like those sounds and all, those can come later because they require a lot of extra work. And I never wanted to put that work, so we never did it. But for the intro music, you can go to a service like Audio Jungle. You can license music. It will cost you think the music that we use costs about $200 for a perpetual license. You'll need to get a license that allows the digital distribution of the modified music content. So yeah, it will be about a couple $100. It's not free, but it's a one-off investment and it's worth it. So basically, yeah, just go to Audio Jungle and you listen to a bunch of stuff, you search and you find what you like. If the price point is good, you just purchase the license and you use that. But yeah, I think music is very important.
And I really like the music that we have.
Yeah, it took me several evenings to find that music, but it was a very well worth time and money spent.
Right. And I think, like you said, there is some sort of a deep emotional connection with the music, right? So if you absentmindedly get into your car, start playing a podcast, and then the music comes on, you immediately get into that headspace that, oh yes, I'm listening to, like, I'll give you an example, the Formula One podcast by BBC. That intro music, it doesn't matter if I hear like 2 seconds of it, I instantly recognize and I'm in that headspace that, okay, I'm listening to that music. So what about the style of the podcast?
A tip we heard from Jake Knapp and Jonathan Courtney in our episode 4, which really resonated with me, is emulate other podcasters.
Yeah.
As I said previously, rip off somebody else's style, but not
like obviously try to rip off everything about it.
You're not trying to just be them. You want to be you, but you can borrow some of the elements of their style. And I think for us, I very much wanted to emulate the Postlight podcast. I think we are doing ours a bit differently, but we borrowed a lot from their style. And I think we borrowed from a bunch of other podcasts. We just are not even consciously aware of that. I would like to play a clip by Jonathan Courtney from our episode 4, where Jonathan talks about how they came up with the idea for their style.
I had an example podcast that I liked called the Giant Bombcast, which I wanted to like emulate. 3-hour show about nothing that I like.
I was always trying to get structure into it, and then John was like, no.
You wanted segments?
Yeah, I wanted segments.
You wanted structure, but neither of us wanted to do any prep work.
Yeah.
And so it was the person who did marginally more prep work could control the show. And one bullet point that I would find once every few weeks was more of prep work.
So in addition to the style, there are a couple of points that Jonathan brings up here. They did not want to do prep work. So their style was very much just ramble about whatever comes to mind. And they've had a very successful podcast. So yeah, sometimes just like winging it is a viable strategy.
I think it requires you to have a lot of domain knowledge and be able to speak very easily about it, which is not a very common set of skills combined.
Yes, but it works for them. It works for us. It works for folks like Postlight. But then some others may want to emulate some dry, to the fact, no emotion, sort of no opinion, just like straight to the facts, kind of news style coverage of something. And that's totally fine. Just do whatever you're comfortable with. And you probably like certain podcasts because, they resonate with you, and you would emulate those for that exact reason, because they speak to something in you and you want to be like that, or you are like that. For these two guys in particular, it was just 3-hour show about nothing. That's what they tried to emulate. It worked out just fine. Another thing I want to call out in this short clip that we just played is that how bad the AirPods are. So Jonathan was wearing AirPods for recording, and you could hear that harsh sound clipping when he was laughing. That's what you get when you use a cheap, or low quality rather, microphone, because AirPods are not cheap, but the microphone quality is very low. It's not optimized for recording.
Yeah, AirPods are like awesome to listen to stuff. I love them. And more than the sound quality, it's the UX that I like, right? Like that it would go from one device to another. But for recording, don't do it.
Yeah, absolutely don't.
Next important part. Are you going to do a narrative show, or are you going to have guests? Guests early on, if you don't have an audience already, that can be a great way to like build your podcast.
Let's briefly touch on the narrative episodes. When I first started my podcast, I wanted to do the first episode as a narrative, basically like talk about things to seed the podcast. I recorded a few hours and I hated everything that I did in that first episode. Like I was saying good things, but like my composure and the way I was talking, I was very tense. I was very stressed just talking to the mic. I didn't even listen back to that. It just came out awfully in my head that I never could even bring myself up to listen to that. And then I eventually ended up having somebody else interview me on the topics that I was interested in. And that was the first episode. Actually, it was also the first episode of this podcast, of the Metacast. You interviewed me about my prior experience with podcasting. So yeah, it was a viable strategy to get started. But if you are somebody who can just easily talk to the mic, just go for it.
Narratives will require more prep though, because you'll have to have like everything lined up. Winging it or like just rambling while in a narrative episode is not going to be very fun to your listeners because it doesn't add that conversational dynamic into it.
Some people can do it really well. Think about those people who can do Instagram stories. They'll just like talk to the camera for a long time. If those people want to start a podcast, they already have the skill. For them, it's just they're moving their skill to a different medium. Whereas if somebody has never done any public things like this, it will be a lot harder. But also, like, if you have done public talks before, you can just put the slides in front of you and just do a talk into the microphone. So that's another way to do it. But it's much easier, in my opinion, to do an interview. When you research your guest, you have a good list of questions and you just go through the interview. It's a conversation. At some point, you start to forget your recording and then it becomes more natural. And then over time, it gets easier. How do you source your guests for the first episode or the first few episodes? Both in our case and also Ronak and Guang from episode 12, they recommended starting with somebody who you know, because then it creates a safe space. So let's say if you're doing a professional podcast, you can invite your colleague, your friend, your classmate, or somebody who is an expert in the area who you already have a good relationship with, because then it can almost guarantee that they will be very friendly, they will be very supportive, they will create a safe space for you. The episode will come out great. If it comes out terribly, they will not be upset if you decide not to publish it. But if you get somebody who is very busy and they spend time with you and then you say, okay, you know what, like, I don't want to publish it, it's too bad, you run the risk of hurting your reputation. Starting with somebody you know, I think is easier and much safer. In fact, the first few episodes I did for my other podcast, they were all either my friends or friends of friends. So yeah, tapping into your network, I think, is very important. The thing is, like, if you cannot tap into your network, think twice if you're doing the podcast in the topic that you can sustain for a long time. Because if you don't have the network in that domain, are you really an expert? At some point, you will want to invite people who you don't know. How do you get to invite them? And what we found, and also we got recommendations for that from many of our guests, is just ask them. And wonderful things happen. People just accept your invitations and they come in. So we had Brian McCullough, the person who hooked me onto podcast with his Internet History podcast back in 2013 or 14. He was the first person I wrote when they started Metacast. And he said yes the next day. It was like, wow, incredible. Later on the show, we asked him why he accepted our invitation. And he said, I know how it's like to get started. If I don't say yes, other people don't say yes. How are you supposed to get started? So that's why I agreed. Then we had some other folks who were busy people, but they still said yes and they came to the show and we had great episodes. The cool thing is you don't just have great guests on your show. You also build a connection with those people that you can tap into later. You can use your guests to ask them for interested people who they know.
And then build your guest ladder.
Yeah. But when you reach out to people with a cold email or cold DM, generally I would say if you can ask somebody to do an intro, ask them for an intro. But if you can't, and you have to write a cold email, that's how I approach this. And I've got a decent number of good responses. So I think the strategy works pretty well. First, I always tell them how I appreciate their work. I'm very specific. I can mention specific episodes they've done. I can mention specific work they've done, especially something from like a long time ago or something that's not very public.
And why it inspired you?
Yeah, why it inspired you. They cannot ignore it because people like hearing good things about themselves. I always get annoyed when people send me messages on LinkedIn saying something like, I really like your profile. Can we do a coffee chat? I'm like, who are you? They even say things that I didn't even do. Or you have this kind of podcast agency or something. The person clearly didn't do any research. Show them you really respect them and respect their work. Then you have to provide something like what's in it for them. Like, why would they come on your show? If you're just getting started, there isn't really much you can provide to those people. I think what we said is like, people have seen your work, but you have never really told your story. People like talking about themselves. So yeah, that's why people say yes.
I think, for example, Brian McCullough, like his podcast, the current one, Tech Meme, those are very popular ones.
Yeah.
But how he got to that place, his story of how did he create them, why are they successful, that's almost never in any content. So it's great for like somebody to talk to them about it and publish it.
They document their story through us, right? And you could find cases like that in what you want to do. Obviously, some people want to promote what they sell. So some people will say yes just because they want to be on any podcast possible. When I did my very first podcast, I used to give away t-shirts for my first guests. I think people appreciated it, but they said yes for different reasons. So it wasn't strictly necessary. But if you can give something, a token of appreciation, I think it is always welcome, though, again, not necessary. What I also found works quite well in inviting people, name dropping. Once you've had a few people on your podcast, then you mention certain names. Like recently, I reached out to somebody who is pretty high profile. I have a booklet of that person. And I saw that he reposted a post of one of our guests. Then there was another person of about, give or take, same age, Justin Frankel, who was on our show, who was very famous because of his creation of Winamp. And I think there was somebody else. Oh, yeah. And he was also on the podcast of Justin Jackson, another guest of ours. So I mentioned all of those three names in my message. And I think when people see familiar names,
it adds credibility.
It adds credibility. How do you know we are legit? So we had these people, like this episode number 2, episode number whatever. I always add a TLDR, too long didn't read, like a short summary at the beginning of my email. I would say, hey, John, TLDR, we want to invite you on our podcast to talk about X, Y, and Z. Here is the calendar link to schedule time with us. And then I say, but here's a long story. And it's like half a page of text about all of the other things. I make it easy for people to understand what we want from them. And then I entice them to take that step to read it further and kind of click the link, book the time with us. I'll play an audio clip right now from Guang, who was a guest on our episode 12 about the email that we sent to him and his co-host Ronak.
I do think even the cold email that you guys sent to us, I think it was a great email.
Oh, yes.
You talked about sort of the why. It just felt very personalized, right? Because we get also spammy emails. I was surprised by how many people reach out either to place someone on your podcast or business stuff. So it's really refreshing to read a nice email from someone who's also in the trenches.
That email actually was sent by Arnab. I remember it was also half a page email with lots of details about how you appreciate their work. And like Guang said, they're inundated by spam and kind of questionable proposals. So ours was a nice, refreshing email that they enjoyed reading and they said yes. And they came on the show. So Arnab, how long did it take you to write that email?
Just to write the email, probably a few hours, but to research everything, because I had listened to all their episodes before. But like you said, you need to refresh all of that and try to remember what were like some really memorable, inspiring moments from their podcasts.
Yeah. So you're talking about maybe like
a couple of days.
I would say, yeah, my case with Brian McCullough and others, that would probably be at least an hour, sometimes a couple of hours, just to write 3 paragraphs. And then it gets subsequently easier because then you can name drop. And you also follow the same template over and over. And actually, initially, we wanted to come up with a template that we sent to our guests. But the very first email just fell apart because we were like, we cannot make it personalized with a template. We cannot use a template.
We receive cold emails about like offering different things, services, and almost all of them, they feel so impersonal because they're templates. And second thing is, where I remember somebody asked us, hey, how about I create some audio clips for you guys? Your episode sounds great, right? And you replied back saying, which were some of those moments you want to create clips about? What episodes did you like? And there was no reply. But it just shows like, one, first is like templates, not putting enough effort to make it personalized. And second, not doing any research.
Yes. And that brings us to the next topic, right? So you get a yes. Now what's next? Like, how do you actually prep for that episode? Because now, like, oh, this is my first recording. What are we going to talk about? Like, what will the flow be? I would like to play a clip from Brian McCullough, our episode 2, because that puts things into perspective.
I'll write up 30 questions, and I know that we'll only get to 10 of those questions. I over-prepare, I over-research, and I have more questions than I need, because then it allows the conversation to go in the direction that is right in the moment. I think bad interviews are when the interviewer wants the conversation to go in a specific direction and they keep pulling it back. And the natural flow of the conversation is
Brian,
going
can I
over
get it back to
here.
the topic, please?
Yes, exactly.
Over-prepare. That has been our mantra. Whenever we have a guest, we always research. We sometimes divide and conquer, come up with a big list of topics. We don't really write questions. We come up with topics. Sometimes we have specific questions too, when it comes to very specific things. And then, we end up not talking to 2/3 of those, just like Ryan was saying. You don't have to cover everything that you have there.
But sometimes when you have a guest and maybe they're not feeling well or they're not in a very talkative mood, it helps to have all those setup questions to get them into the mood. And also, in case you ask something and they say, yes, move on.
Yeah, those are the more difficult ones. And when you over-prepare, it doesn't just make your podcast better, your episode better. It also shows your guest that you really value them. You know how you call the call center and they tell you they call you a valued customer, but don't care about you at all.
Wait time is 6 hours. We really value you.
You want your guest to come in and be like, wow, these people really did their homework. Everybody likes being asked questions that are relevant. You really want to go into topics that people are really excited about. Listen to podcasts where they had been before or talks that they've done. Like, see what really sparks that energy in them and then double down on those topics. And I would like to play a clip from Zach, the CEO of Squadcast, on our episode 8, where he praised us for our preparation, not to be too self-congratulatory, but that's what people say when you really prepare well.
I always am paying attention. I like to note people's level of preparation because that's something that we are big on and recommend to our customers and community. And some people do it, some people don't. Thank you, by the way, for your level of preparation for this episode. One thing that I noted was that you gave the option to have a pre-interview conversation or not. You kind of left it up to the guest. I've never seen it given as an option.
Zach mentions a pre-interview, which we also call pre-call. When we first were getting started, we always asked our guests for doing a pre-interview call where we would just chat for half an hour, tell them about ourselves, kind of meet and greet, tell them about the topics we want to cover, which was very helpful, especially when you're just getting started and you may be nervous, especially if somebody who you don't know. One thing that Zach also said later in that interview is that usually people either tell you, oh, you have to join that pre-interview call with us, or they just don't offer it at all. What we've done is, if you want to, we can do a 30-minute meet and greet call. We offered him an option. They actually declined that option, but they were appreciative that we didn't force them into this.
And I think when we don't do it, we tell guests upfront that maybe we'll spend the first 10 minutes not recording it, but just to prep and get ready with all of our talking points, right? And sometimes, actually, there was an episode where you and I felt that it was very awkward in the beginning because we had never met that person. But slowly over the recording of the episode, it flew well and we kind of warmed up to each other. So if you don't do a pre-call, you have never talked to this person, you're not familiar with each other, do spend that initial bit of time before you start recording to kind of be personal and break the ice.
All right. And then comes the planning part. You want to use a service like Calendly, calendly.com, to make it easy for your guests to schedule time with you. Just send them a link and they can pick the time that works for them. We also have found value in creating a checklist for what you want to cover in an interview. So things like introduce your guest, introduce yourself. At the end of the interview, ask the guest where people can find them on social networks. Don't forget to mention give us a 5-star review. So by the way, if you're listening to this or watching, hit the like button, subscribe to our show, give us a 5-star rating. And we would like tick this in the checklist when we say this. And another point that we found important is because we are both co-hosts, if we are both responsible for the checklist, it means nobody's responsible. We appoint one person to be the check police to make sure that we cover the topics that we need to cover, to say things that we need to say, to kind of police the conversation a little bit. But we mean it in a very joking way. It's not like Arnab would just tell me to do something. He would just say, oh, and by the way, give us a 5-star rating. So yeah, if you haven't done it, so please do it now.
And I think things like introducing yourselves, introducing your guest, asking them at the end where to find them and all sounds very common sense. But when you're actually in a recording session and you've been recording for like an hour, you will forget it. You really need to have a checklist. It's minimal effort to have a quick checklist. You don't need to write everything down. Just a reminder and a checklist of like items that you want to focus on. Sometimes what tends to happen in our recordings is we'll drift from topic to topic. So we do in our checklist like different sections so that we can drift and then sometimes maybe come back to another section because it's not going to go as you plan and you don't want to force that kind of timeline on your guest too.
Yeah, like Brian said, right? The worst interviews are those where the interviewer has an agenda. I have a checklist. I'm just working through the list. It ends up boring.
I've got my recording gear. I've chosen somewhere to record at. I don't have my dog barking in the background.
But yeah, keep it real. If things happen.
Yeah. And now I've got guests. It's recording time. What do I do?
One thing to remember is garbage in, garbage out. So if your recording quality is bad, there are ways to fix it, but there are limited ways to fix it. Like if your car is scratched, you can wash it as many times as you want. It will not remove the scratch. You can think the same way about the recording. So you want to ensure as best setup as you can, both for you and for your guest. And by the way, the tips we gave for you, like being in the closet, having all those pillows and towels and all that stuff, give the same advice to the guests. They will be talking most of the time. So you want to make sure that they sound well.
Ask them not to use AirPods, even if they sometimes do.
Boy, yeah. So it's actually better to use a computer microphone than AirPods. Make sure that you test your setup ahead of time. So if you use a Squadcast or something else for the first time, make sure you know how to use the tool in and out. A, you don't want to face any technical glitches yourself. But B, when your guest has problems, you want to be able to help them troubleshoot. With your microphone, you may want to lower the gain. So gain is the amount of amplification on the microphone. And if you use Blue Yeti, it just has a gain knob. If you use something like Shure MV7, like I'm using, it has software that you install on your computer where you can control the gain. If you use Shure MV SM7B that connects to an audio interface, the audio interface will have the knobs, like physical knobs that you turn. Let's say if you record in Squadcast, if you say something, it shows your sound in green, yellow, red zone. You want to stay in the green as much as possible. It should never go to red. If you laugh and it goes to red, your gain is too high. You need to lower the gain. What I would recommend is do some recordings of yourself and listen back to them and see how you sound so that you have a certain predefined setup that you always use when you record. And you can tweak it along as you go. If you have clipping, like we heard in Jonathan Courtney's recording on AirPods, it's not fixable.
Unrecoverable.
It's unrecoverable pretty much. It's like a scratch in your car. You can't wash it away. And then, like we were saying, like make sure your room is very well prepared. Your guest room is very well prepared. We highly recommend using tools that support video calls, like Squadcast, so you can actually see your guest. If you're doing just audio only, it still helps to see the guest, to see their emotion, to help better navigate the conversation. I would also say join the call before your guest, at least 3-5 minutes before, so you can get all of your technical issues sorted out. And also, it's just polite to come before your guest.
Even though you're on video and you're using a tool online, you should make sure to record it locally and not use the online version of the audio, even if the tool offers it.
Yeah, like if you're doing Squadcast, it will give you a cloud recording. It's like a Zoom recording where everything is mixed together. Or you can download all of your guests and yourself as a separate audio track, which is recorded locally, like Arnab is saying. So you don't have to do anything extra for it. It already happens in those tools. We go into that in our book, which you can download in the links in the show notes.
Mixed together recordings, what tends to happen is because the audio is so different from different tracks, but it's already pre-mixed, it's very hard for you to engineer it easily after that point.
Let's play a clip from Jenny, who was a guest on our episode 17. We shared an unprocessed, mixed together track with her. And that's what she had to say about the quality of what she heard.
Well, the recording you shared with me, Ilya was super, super quiet. And so I turned it way up. I was walking, so I had my earbuds in and I could hear Ilya, and then someone else talked and it just like blew my eardrums out. So I was like turning it up, turning it down. I eventually just decided to ignore Ilya. I was like, whatever he said, I'll figure out based on context. I can't keep doing this.
It's not important.
So yeah, as you can hear, people's volumes might be different. There might be dogs barking in the background. And if we have tracks separated, like Arnab's track is its own file, my track is its own file. If a dog barks when I'm talking, we could just cut that part out. If all of the audio is mixed together, like you would have in a Zoom recording, that you can't. That dog bark is just going to be there, like a blemish. You can't take it out. And that can be very distracting. Then also volumes might be different, like Jenny was saying. Imagine if my volume was very low and somebody was laughing while I was speaking and their volume was much louder. The important part, what I had to say, would be completely inaudible. You can really screw your podcast if you mix things together and don't separate them.
Don't stress too much about these things though. Like our brains are pretty good at taking out all of these information. As long as the audio quality is pretty decent, all of these other things we tend to ignore as we are listening to podcasts. But like you said, if one track is super low or I have to constantly finesse over the volume as I'm listening to it, that distracts me from the actual content that's being said.
Unless they are your mom or your friend, there will be little incentive for them to continue listening after all that struggle, all that friction that they have to go through. The thing that you already mentioned, Arnab, is like when we first start recording, sometimes chemistry is unknown. You don't know if there is chemistry. Maybe you feel like it's a bit awkward. What do you do with a guest like that? Or it's not even the guest, right? There is just a little match, right? Or maybe you just don't know each other. You need to open up. Let's hear Steph Colborn, who is a podcast producer, who was in our episode 6, where she mentions the rapid fire questions.
And then if you are just like an awkward bean, sometimes we'll start an interview with rapid fire questions and completely like throw them out, like just as a way to break the ice. Like we don't actually publish them. We just use them as like a tool to like get people out of their shell.
So yeah, like Steph said, you don't have to hit the record button right away. You can talk for a little bit and build that rapport with the interviewee and then throw all of that out and only keep the good parts that come afterward. And the last thing I would add about the recording process, you need to avoid making noises. We already talked about AC and heaters and all that stuff. But how about you yourself making noises? Yes, exactly. Sneeze, scratch your beard, gulp water, touch the cord of the microphone, touch the microphone itself. If you're hungry, your stomach might make noises. Finger clicking, which you are never guilty of, but you've improved a lot on that front.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a habit of scratching my beard quite a bit.
That's why you shaved it short now.
Yes. Phones may make noises or vibrate, which you actually may not hear because of your headphones in the moment. But you will hear that later on the recording because the microphone will pick it up. And also, don't put a laptop on your laps and the microphone on that laptop. We had an episode where our guest was using this kind of setup. Boy, we had so much noise. Because his microphone was unstable, it would touch his shirt, or he would touch it with his hands, or it would touch the laptop. It was a very difficult recording to edit.
Also, if the microphone is moving around, even a small difference in the distance between you and the microphone makes quite a big amount of difference in how it sounds like later on. So you'll have to edit it a lot if it's moving around. So that's great. Like you try to reduce all of these noises as much as possible. But there's probably tools available to do this too if you cannot, right?
Yeah. Then it brings us to post-production, which is probably the most technical. Well, it definitely is the most technical and the most difficult part of the whole process. So what is post-production? Post-production is editing your audio. It's like painting your car after it has been assembled, right? It has to look nice. And the same way your audio needs to sound nice. People study for many years in schools to learn the craft of producing high quality audio for music, for podcasting, for broadcasting, for television, for whatever. So one thing to remember, as I said, garbage in, garbage out. The more you remove the garbage initially, the less you have to stress about it later. Because then you don't need to remove all of those dog noises and all that stuff. But still, unprocessed audio will have a bunch of things like mouth clicks. Guess what? When we talk, there is saliva and it creates clicks that microphones pick up, which you don't hear normally. But once you hear your voice on the recording, then you start hearing those. Then there are certain frequency ranges in our voices that maybe are not as pleasant on the recording, and you want to like lower them down, and there are some other ranges that you want to bring up. Editing all of that is post-production. There are also things like you might have very long pauses, or you talked about things that you decide not to publish, or you want to cut them, or you want to change the order of the things that you said. All of that manipulation of audio is part of post-production. So here is what we think is absolutely necessary, and everything else is kind of optional. Editing the content is necessary. Unless you are a radio host who can talk for an hour straight with no mistakes and it all sounds great, well, good for you. Why are you listening to us then? If you are like most of us, you would probably cut out at least 5 to 10% of content from what you recorded. So basically you open your audio in a tool like Audacity, which is a free open source software, or you can use Reaper, which costs $60 for a perpetual license, which is my choice, or you can use more expensive tools. I think Reaper is that golden kind of middle ground because it's professional, it's easy to use, it costs very little, and it's very, very powerful. So yeah, you just want to go through the entire audio, listen to it, and then cut out pieces, like long pauses. If a pause is like 10 seconds, on audio, it sounds pretty awful. It sounds like, okay, like, is my audio working? So you want to make it more like 1 second, or maybe 1.5 seconds. You still want to keep that pause in because it's a natural flow of the conversation, but you don't want it to be 10 seconds long.
Counterpoint here very quickly is emotional moments. If there is a pause because of an emotional moment, do keep that. Otherwise, it sounds very unnatural.
Yes. Actually, let's play a clip from Steph from our episode 6, where she talks exactly about that.
Similar, like if there's like an emotional moment or, you know, sort of a stressful moment, you'll want to keep them in too, because those are things that naturally people put in when they're finding it hard to find words. And if you take them out, it kind of makes a person sound like an asshole. So got to leave those ones in too.
You want to make sure that the speech sounds natural. You can cut like all pauses. I've seen people do that. And then the speech just starts to sound robotic. And you don't want robotic speech. I would rather listen to a 10-second pause than to listen to a speech that has no pauses at all. It sounds like you just feed a bunch of stuff to Siri and she just blurts it out uncontrollably. That's the minimum. Cut out the pauses, cut out the things that you don't want to be said. Then I would also work with breaths. Some breaths are very loud. Some people are very heavy breathers. And they would like talk and then like, talk. And you don't hear that in natural speech, but microphones pick this up and it sounds distracting. So you would want to work with those breaths. But the thing is, if you just remove the breaths, in most cases, you remove that pause that the breath created, and then it starts to sound robotic. So what normally I would do is cut half of the breath. The other half, I would reduce the volume to be almost inaudible, but it leaves that natural pause in.
What tool do you do this? Is this in Reaper?
I do it in Reaper. So in Reaper, you just select that part of the clip and then you just reduce the volume. And we cover all of that in our book and the video course. Links are in show notes. So yeah, if you want to get a little bit more technical on this. And the last thing, I would say, is equalizer. Equalizer is the technique where you amplify or lower down certain frequency ranges in the voice. And there are some hacks for how you can do that. It's very hard to explain in audio only or without like showing this. So again, this is something that you can find in our videos. When you don't equalize, it still sounds decent, but you can make it sound a lot better by just applying a couple of very, very simple hacks. And those plugins, they're all free. You don't have to spend money. So they're just a good practice to apply. Some people would argue that you also need to use a compressor. Compressors are pretty difficult to use. In a nutshell, if you move away from the microphone, or if your volume changes, if you start to whisper, and if somebody is riding a metro train, or if they're in a car, or if they're outside, there's a lot of noise, the volume can go so low that they cannot hear you anymore for that particular moment. What compression does, it aligns loudness of all of those moments to the same baseline. It's very difficult to master though. So I would say, as a good practice, just stay close to the mic and have your guests stay close to the mic, and then you'll be fine. On top of that, you can buy more tools. Once you decide that podcasting is your thing and you actually want to invest in this, you can spend $500 on the tool suite called Isotope, which we use. Our sound producer uses, which Steph from episode 6 uses. She's a professional editor.
This is a one-time $500, not a subscription.
Yes, yeah. It's Isotope RX suite of filters. It's the industry standard. Like TV channels, radio stations, like everybody uses Isotope. It's amazing. It can reduce the volume of breaths for you, so you don't have to do it yourself manually. It can remove those mouth clicks from the recording. It can fix some of the clipping. It can fix explosives. It can fix sibilants, those kind of annoying hissing noises. And it's just impossible to listen unless you apply those filters. It can also help with some of the background noise. It can reduce the reverberation, the echo.
So is this an AI tool?
I don't know how exactly it works, but I think, they say it is. It's amazing. It doesn't always remove everything. It's not a kind of single pill that you just take for everything, but it does wonders.
It reduces your work by 90%, and then you just focus on the remaining bits.
By the way, with all those tools and microphone and all that, wait for Black Friday or some other sales. You might get this stuff like 20-30% cheaper. Like my microphone, I think I got it with like 30% discount on Black Friday last year. Then another tool that you can use is called Descript. It transcribes your text. They support about 20-30 languages as of this recording. You can manipulate the transcript. You can remove certain parts of text, or you can move it around, and it moves the audio around for you. And you can even edit audio, but it will have a transcript on top of the audio, so it makes it a lot easier to recognize what it is you are listening to. Especially if you do narration, or if you do like highly post-produced shows with like lots of content and you need to move the story around. Descript is very powerful for that.
So this is for like content editing. That's what you primarily use it for.
Yes, yeah.
I think you mentioned another iPad app you used to use too, right? Like Ferrite?
Oh, yes, Ferrite. You can use Ferrite with an Apple Pencil on the iPad. I don't know if it supports non-Pro versions. Probably does. I have an iPad Pro with the Apple Pencil too. Yeah, and I can edit on my laps. It's very, very convenient.
That doesn't transcribe it, right? Like you're actually just listening and editing, but it makes the UX of editing very easy.
Yes, yeah. Descript is only tool that transcribes. And we cover those tools in more detail in our videos because it's impossible to cover all of that in a single episode. To recap what we've just discussed, you do some basic editing in the tool, which will take you hours, by the way. So for 1 hour of audio, even when you are very well trained and experienced, it will still take you maybe 3 hours for each hour of content to edit. Yeah, and then you produce an MP3 file you can publish to the world to listen to.
And you mentioned at a minimum, you do like basically the content editing and maybe a bit of sound editing. If you have something like Isotope, just let it go through it, and that's about it. After that, it's up to you to finesse.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, people obsess about filler words because when they hear themselves talk, it's like all this and like and kinda, sorta. here's the thing. When you hear your own voice, you have your guard up. You're very conscious and very critical of everything you hear. So you may feel like you speak really badly. However, our brains have evolved to ignore the filler words. So when you actually hear somebody else talk, like actually listen to a podcast by Lex Friedman, for example, because it has video, you know it's not edited if you look at the video. And people do have those filler words and all, you don't notice them. And that's how your listeners will perceive this. Of course, if you have excessive filler words, then you may want to cut them a little bit. But if you have a moderate amount of fillers, obviously it's cool to remove all them, and it makes you sound really professional, like a TV anchor. But be ready for just spending hours and hours and hours. And also, if your filler words are part of the flow of your speech, if you cut them, you can start creating those clipping noises, and the speech just sounds unnatural after you remove them. Sometimes it's best to keep them in to still keep that natural flow than to cut them out.
Exactly. So like we've published everything, we've like post-produced, we've done all of this, like, you know, like all the things so far. What do we do next?
You've not published yet.
Okay, I was thinking too much about the filler words and giving an example there.
You see, my brain filtered it out.
All right, let's talk about publishing, the next step.
So now you need to publish it to the world. And it is very, very easy. If you're just getting started, I suggest you just go with the simplest option. Just use Spotify for podcasters or Substack, where you can just upload your files, and it gives you a link to that RSS feed, the address from which your podcast can be found by podcasting apps. You submit it to Apple, you submit it to Spotify, you submit it to, I guess, YouTube Music now supports podcasts. You want your podcast to be available anywhere. So you just submit to all of those platforms, but Apple and Spotify are the most important ones. They command probably 60 to 70% of listenership share globally. After a few hours, sometimes after a couple of days, they will index your podcast, they will add you to their catalog, and you become discoverable. And then next time you publish a new episode, you upload it to Anchor or Substack or Transistor.fm, whichever one you choose to use.
So would you like publish your first episode immediately? Or because one problem that we also saw is we shared it and not all platforms would have the podcast immediately.
Yeah, that's pretty annoying because it takes time for the podcasting apps to pick up your show. Like when you first get started, it may take days for your podcast to appear on some platforms, whereas it takes hours to appear on some other platforms. A good practice is to record a trailer. A trailer could just be your first episode, just cut a few pieces from it. Just create something. Nobody's going to listen to it anyway because nobody knows about you unless you advertise yourself. Just let it sit there for a few weeks while you are working on your first episode and all that. Once you're ready to publish, you already have your podcast established. Platforms already know about it. And then you can remove the trailer or keep it if you like. It's important to keep consistency in your publishing schedule. It can be hard, especially if you're first getting started. Everything is new. Post-production takes forever for each episode. You can record a few episodes in advance. That's what our guests from episode 4 did, Jake and Jonathan. That's what we have done. We recorded 6 episodes. I think that's what they did as well, 6 episodes ahead of time, so that we didn't stress about keeping the schedule. So we had enough content for the first month and a half, the first 6 weeks. Yeah, that kept us going. And then in that time, we were recording kind of subsequent episodes. In addition to the podcast, we also have a newsletter on Substack. We don't host our podcast on Substack. Actually, Substack didn't support podcast when we first started. We do a newsletter where we collect our show notes, and, I just like doing short write-ups about every episode that we do. I think it's a good way to keep an additional drumbeat going. Also, social media helps a lot. Some people use Instagram, some people use LinkedIn, some people use Twitter. We use mostly LinkedIn and Substack.
Try these things, see what works for you, and double down on the ones that work for you.
Yeah, and this brings us to marketing, right? So marketing of podcasts is really hard. Just because of the way podcast discovery works today, Spotify, Apple, they just keep promoting the big shows. And then the small ones who are just getting started, unless people search for you, you will never be recommended. Unless you hit some kind of like success and you get into the featured list, which is not the case for most. It definitely wasn't the case for us. But if you already have an audience, so if you're, let's say, an Instagrammer or YouTuber and you start a podcast, you just throw it out there and then people start listening. Good for you. If you're building your audience from scratch, it's much harder. The thing I want to play now is an audio clip from Brian McCullough from our episode 2, where he talks about the most important thing in podcasting is content.
Gaining an audience, anyone can do it if you're willing to put in the time and the effort and you do it strategically, but you'll only succeed in the end if once you get to the stage, you have something to say. The analogy I use is rolling a snowball down a hill. At the top of the hill, your snowball's tiny. By the time you get down there, it's huge. And everyone's like, well, of course, because he has that huge snowball. No one saw the tiny snowball at the beginning. But if you don't have the goods, once you finally get to that stage, then you're never going to have an audience.
Yeah, like Brian said, you got to have the goods. The content should be interesting. Regardless of how much promotion you do, if people don't stick around, well, you just keep bleeding those users, or leaking those users in a leaky bucket, right? So you want to have a show that once people discover it, they actually like it and stick with it.
And I think this goes back to choosing a topic that you're really interested about, you have some expertise in, and something that you can sustain for a long time.
It will be a long time for most of us, most of you, before you get any meaningful audience. To give an example, right, when I first started my first podcast, I already had an audience. It wasn't big. It was maybe like 4,000 or 5,000 people. But I dropped my podcast there and I got 1,000 listens on my very first episode within a couple of weeks. Whereas with the Metacast, we didn't have that luxury. We had maybe like 100 or 200 listens. It takes time to build that audience.
And that brings in like, how do you use your guests to promote your show?
Yeah, I think probably pretty much all of our guests recommended that you have to be strategic about your guests. Bring people who already have audience, who can promote you to their audiences. When we interviewed Brian McCullough, his Tech Meme Ride Home episodes have 40 to 50,000 listens each episode.
And that's a daily show. So that's like 40 to 50,000 people listening daily.
Yeah. And in one of the Friday episodes, he said, guess what? I don't have a weekend episode for you, but I'll get you the next best thing. Listen to Metacast, where I was a guest on. We just had this spike in listens after that, where people just came and started listening to our show. Jonathan Courtney did a reaction to our episode on his podcast. Guess what? We got a bunch of views on YouTube after that because he used our YouTube video. And then when we released a Justin Frankel episode, the creator of Winamp, he himself doesn't have a huge audience, but he has a large fandom. We posted on Reddit and we got a spike in listens right away and lots of kind of good feedback and all. Leveraging your guests is very important to bootstrap your audience. Social networks, like we said, work if you already have an audience. If you don't, it takes time to build.
How do you like attract people to leave, subscribe, reviews and all that on your show?
For the third time, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, give us a rating.
Most importantly, leave a comment.
Yeah, leave a comment or send us an email at hello@metacastpodcast.com. One of our guests, Christian, the CEO and co-founder of the Podder app, podcast analytics app, on episode 18, said that they've seen in their data that people who are more successful with getting more reviews are the people who read reviews out loud. And let's play a clip where Christian talks about that.
There are some shows that generate a lot more reviews than others, and typically they spend a large portion of time in the beginning of the shows to read out reviews since last time, thanking people personally, encouraging to leave reviews and so on. And this actually really works. People leave a lot more reviews. And even though reviews don't directly play into Apple chart rankings, which Apple has debunked, then psychologically it makes a difference. If you see a show with loads of reviews, you're more likely to listen to it. So I do really encourage you to try to be very active with this. But a personal approach, like saying, thank you last time, we'd like to shout out to Antoine. Thank you for leaving this review.
All right. So Antoine is leaving us a review. Good.
Absolutely.
And our other guests, Angela and Annie from episode 10 of the Hearts in Taiwan podcast, they also send out stickers of their show to the people who left the reviews and also provided them with the details to send the stickers to, which also can work. It doesn't cost you much. Like a sticker cost is negligible. The post stamp is like 50 cents in the US at least. It's nice. People love it. And by the way, their show is also very niche. They talk to American Taiwanese about what it is like to be Taiwanese. So by definition, their audience is very small, but it's a very loyal audience because that's the kind of content and community they cannot find anywhere else. It's a perfect example of a niche podcast. And yeah, listen to episode 10 of the Metacast podcast, of our podcast, to learn more about how they've done their show.
In terms of like doing this over and over again, right, on a weekly or whatever schedule you have, what are some of your advice?
Persistent schedule helps build a habit. We've heard this over and over from our guests, that it helps people build a habit of listening to you on certain days. Persistency is key here, because if you don't publish for a long time, then people forget about you. They switch to something else. So you want to be part of the people's schedule, their morning commute on Wednesdays or whenever it is you publish. However, if you're doing this just for yourself, a weekly schedule can really kill you.
Yeah, it's daunting.
It's daunting because it's a lot of work and it might just drain you. And then you'll stop having fun and there is no point in doing this, right? So let's play a clip from Angela Yu from episode 10 and see what she has to say about a weekly schedule.
I know that with all content creation, the best practices are to have a regular publishing schedule and especially have a weekly, at least, publishing schedule. But that was just unsustainable for us because we both have full-time jobs and we're working parents. We just have a lot of other commitments. And our goal with this is not to become a full-time or revenue-generating enterprise. So it just doesn't make sense for us to kind of kill ourselves to meet a weekly publishing schedule.
Life happens. It's best to publish monthly than to publish weekly and be deeply unhappy and stop publishing at all at some point.
And I think the main thing is the initial part is going to be hard. Unless you have a substantial following already, that's where, again, we keep harping on this and everybody keeps saying this. Pick something that you're passionate about. Pick a schedule and a workflow that you can sustain and keep doing it again and again. And maybe those first few ones are just your friends and family listening to you. But even then, you're giving somebody some joy out of it already. But over time, grow that into a snowball and make it bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it will just keep compounding over time. And like you said, you have to have fun with it, right? As long as you have fun with it, it doesn't matter how many people listen to it. That might be a lot harder if you do like highly produced narrative episodes, if nobody listens to them and you're just doing all of that by yourself. That's no fun. But like you and I, even if nobody listens to us, I still enjoy talking to you. Or if you have guest interviews, you get to meet people, you get to network, you've met somebody new and interesting. That is by itself a reward.
You get to learn so much, right? Like different domains, people come with their own like different human experiences and you get to hear all that. And I think on top of all that, it makes you a better listener because as a podcast host, most of the time that you're spending is listening to people and figuring out where to go from here, what's the next segment you want to go, but keep it all natural. So makes you a really good listener and like a conversationalist.
And let's play a clip from Brock Felder from our episode 10. Who talks about how podcasting makes you better. So even if nobody listens to you, you still get to benefit a lot from this.
Where I see the benefits of podcasting show up is actually when I'm talking to non-podcasting people. So like typically comes up with family or friends and I'm like asking them these questions and they're like, wow, you're asking some good questions and you're a great listener. And it's like, I'm genuinely interested, but I also do think that this experience in podcasting has just kind of improved my ability to do both of those things in a way where I don't even realize I'm necessarily doing it. But if it makes people feel special, I'm all about that. So that's good.
On the same episode, Rock's co-founder, Zach, also called out that interviewing for podcasting helped them become better job interviewers. So when people come to interview for jobs in their company, they are able to listen better, to ask better questions, to probe deeper. You get to benefit a lot in terms of your communication skills. It kind of opens you up as long as you lean into this and learn and practice and don't give up. The other good advice that we've heard from many people, but in particular on episode 22 from Justin Lemmy, who is a radio host, is practicing. Listening back to what you say and making tweaks over and over and over. Let's hear what he had to say about practice. It's a very fun story. I really enjoyed that.
I would go over to the production studio and I would listen to the FM DJs and how they would talk. And I would try to replicate it. I'd be like, 96.1 KLPX rocks Tucson. Hey, it was Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin. Coming up, your chance to win tickets to go see James Dio in concert. I would practice that over and over and over again. And I finally got a chance to be on the radio.
And here's the thing. People say, oh, you have a radio voice. But guess what? It takes time to develop. Yeah, some people are more naturally gifted in some ways, but you can develop this. If you heard me speak on the record 2 or 3 years ago, boy, that was much worse. I mean, I'm not perfect right now. Far from being perfect. I still have a lot of room to grow, but I've grown a lot. So will you, as long as you practice.
And keep notes about all of, like, basically keep takeaways, produce the show notes, and maybe someday you'll use it like we are doing in this episode.
Yeah, that's actually a meta hack, right? So we've recorded 25 episodes. And for each of those episodes, religiously, I would go through the episode before we publish it. And I would write down all the podcasting related takeaways and put them in our show notes. And to create this episode and also the outline for the book and the course, all I had to do is just go through those takeaways. It took me maybe a couple of hours to go through those. It would be impossible for me to listen through, 30, 35 hours of audio content. But reading through those bullet points was very easy. Taking notes is a skill, and I think it takes time. It feels like overhead at times. But when you want to look back into your work in perspective, it helps a lot.
This is the last thing we're going to talk about. Ilya told me over and over again that it's going to take some time to get used to your voice. And even then I was like, the first recording we did, and then I'd listen to the raw recording. I was like, oh no, what are we doing? But I think with the good amount of post-processing and listening to it over and over again, you get used to it.
Yeah, you just have to recognize that people hear you the way you hear yourself on a recording. You hear yourself differently because of those vibrations that go through the skull and all. You hear yourself through that inner ear, which people don't have access to. And if you don't like the sound of your own voice on a recording, there is only one way to go with that. You just have to accept it. By doing that, you're accepting who you are and you're accepting how people hear you. So yeah, podcasting also helps you accept yourself and be kinder to yourself and love yourself more. There are so many benefits to podcasting.
So start one tomorrow.
Start one now.
Yeah, why wait till tomorrow? Do it now.
Literally, when I started my third podcast, which was an experiment, I don't do it anymore. I did it within 1 hour. So from the idea to the publication of the first episode, it took me 1 hour. It was a very short episode, like 5 minutes. But the thing is, like, as long as you know how to use the tools, you can have an idea and launch it the same day. But if you don't know what you're doing and you maybe follow the things that we outlined here, maybe if you get our book and you follow things step by step or our course, you can probably get there in a week. I think within a week, you can master the basics and then you can launch your podcast. If you're ambitious, you can probably do it in a couple of days. The first episode, the quality will be lower. Don't be a perfectionist. Nobody's going to listen to this anyway, except for a few people. It's okay. Be easy on yourself. And with that, I think we got to wrap up. I'm getting tired. And that's another thing. Like, I don't know how Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan do their 10-hour episodes.
Yeah. All right. This was awesome. So Ilya, the links to the PDF and eventually a video course and all that will be right here in the show notes of this episode. Leave us a review, rating, comments. You can always send us an email at hello@metacastpodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, and if you know somebody who's into podcasting or wants to start a podcast, share our shows with them. We'll highly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.